The local nymphs and fauns once lived in these groves, and a race of men born of trees with tough timber, who had no laws or culture and didn't know how to yoke oxen or gather wealth or lay aside a store. But the branches fed them, and the hunters wild fare. So, in the poet Virgil's words, the legendary King Evander described the primeval landscape upon which Rome would one day flourish and grow, a landscape that would one day disappear underneath that celebrated veneer of bricks and marble as the pomp and ceremony of empire increased and the crowds and bustle of urban life pushed the wildernesses ever further to the edges of civilization. It is a landscape we have frequented regularly in this series, and in particular in the last couple of episodes through our gods of the wild woods and forests, first with Silvanus, the lord of the trees, and then with Picus, Rome's divine ancestral woodpecker king. The uncultivated leafy groves stand partly in contrast to civilization with all its human constructions and efforts and edifices, but they partly stand also as its precursor, as we've just heard. Old King Evander described the future site of Rome, a layer beneath what we see, beyond what exists now, an earlier, wilder time that is the wellspring of all these things, still percolating through the ancient lived experience. It's a landscape the Romans enjoyed conjuring in their not-so-distant past. They revelled in it, in art and literature especially, and so it still lingers not only in our visions of the ancient Roman past, but for many of us in our own imaginations today, and in our own real encounters with the wild world that exists beyond our meddlings with it, the world of wild nature. It's a landscape haunted by the voices of the fauns. In this episode, we'll explore the realm of the faun. Who were these elusive creatures frolicking in the woods? What did they represent? What does their hybrid nature tell us about the ancient relationship with the divine and the natural world, and, moreover, ancient thinking about human nature? And who was the deity who, in Roman society, represented all these things? To find out, we must once again put down our affectations of civilization and head once more for the trees. Listen carefully to the sounds emanating from the wild places, the tap-tapping of the woodpecker and the reverberating voices drifting eerily out of the leafy shadows. The sound of panpipes beckons in the distance. Somewhere the forest is inviting us to dance. Come, step off the path, push on deeper into the woods, and let us enter the realm of Faunus. You, fauns, the farmers' local gods, come dance together, fauns and forest nymphs. Your gifts I sing. Words again from the poet Virgil, encapsulating the spirit of the fauns, which is one of music and dancing and abandon. The fact that Virgil calls them the farmers' local gods tells us at once both that these were deities familiar to rustic settings and also that they were important to farmers, which makes sense as their fields and farms were the hinterland that segued into the woods, from the unseen groves of which many people could swear they had heard the voices and the sounds of their revels. But before going any further, we must ask, what precisely is a faun? Many of us may already have some sense of these divine creatures playfully romping around the woods with nymphs, and many of us may also have a sense that the form of these creatures wasn't quite human. Sometimes there are hints of horns and goat legs too. When we think about it more closely, however, we might find that we aren't entirely sure of their form, or what they were, or how they really belonged in the Roman religious landscape. And while we may be familiar enough with the idea of fauns, we might not know about Faunus, the Roman faun god par excellence. And so we'll take stock here. So far in this series, we've often encountered anthropomorphism in Roman religion, that is, gods being humanized in form, and we've witnessed repeatedly amorphous, numinous divinities coming out of formless, animistic thinking into perfectly divine-looking human bodies when sculpted into cult statues and stamped on coins and so forth. What we're confronted with when thinking about fauns, however, is theriomorphism. That is, the morphing into animal forms and bestial animal nature. Fauns stand at the strange intersections of man and beast, man and God, beast and God. They represent something at once both recognizable and familiar, and something very other. And it's this combination that gives them an edge. The uncanny, in German unheimlich, was famously theorized by Sigmund Freud in his 1919 essay Das Unheimliche, referring to something that is familiar yet alien at the same time, producing discomfort or eeriness in the resulting cognitive tension. The German word is beautifully revealing in its structure because heimlich means literally home-like, that is, something familiar and comfortable. So unheimlich is at a superficial level unhomelike, unhomely, unfamiliar, and discomforting. The double meaning, however, which Freud homed in on was that heimlich also meant something intimate, concealed within a home, private, and therefore secret. So unheimlich also conveyed a sense of something that ought to have remained hidden, but which has come to light. So the uncanny then is the unsettling mix of familiar and unfamiliar, and also the return or appearance of something once intimate but repressed or concealed, now coming into view. We all know where this led in terms of Freud and his theories, but leaving psychoanalysis aside, this is useful to think with in terms of the hybrid creatures of ancient mythology in relation to theriomorphism and specifically fauns. We have in fact already dabbled in this territory in the previous episode about Picus, and you might like to watch that episode before this one if you haven't seen it already, as it's the precursor to this one, and together they are twin parts of the same story. If you have already watched it, you'll remember that Picus was somehow simultaneously a god, a woodpecker, and a human king. And we saw that Roman mythology wrestled with his human form and rationalized it in various ways. In practice, though, what we saw was that Rome had, very close to its heart, a divine woodpecker. In myth, his human body had been taken over by the animal form, but I suggested the historical trajectory of Picus may have been the other way around, with the sacred woodpecker being explained away and reconciled with later Roman religious sensibilities by retroactively being given a past and human form. We've therefore already seen a Roman deity coming in and out of an animal body in non-linear ways, so perhaps it's no accident then that the child that Picus bore with his love, the nymph Carnens, who could move even the rocks with the beauty of her voice, was Faunus, the divine faun god. Like Picus, he too was oracular, and his voice from the woods was known to be prophetic, and he too straddled the human, animal, and divine. As we saw previously, Picus was considered an ancestor of the Roman people from the earliest times, the age of Saturn, who was his father. So Faunus, the son and grandson respectively, was also conceptually part of the Roman lineage and inheritance, and he was considered another of Rome's archaic, earliest deities. His voice echoes with half-forgotten things, still remembered in sensations and unformed thoughts rising from age-old memories. And here already, in the sounds of the forest, which can rouse simultaneously the excitement of fear and familiarity, flickers the unheimlich, the unhomely homecoming, something we can't quite remember and yet can never quite forget. I would argue that this is what fauns represented generally in Roman culture, humans with one foot still in nature, with a place still in the natural order of things, in a world where nature and culture still collided in reconcilable ways, and where the woods were not as alien and indecipherable as they became. That sensation we sometimes feel if we have a moment alone in the forest is often loaded with such feelings. One viewer recently described them wonderfully as the holy shivers, and this is precisely what fauns represented and what they evoked. Faunus as a god embodied those holy shivers we receive from the wild places. He embodies the divine essence of wild man, natural, primordial man, naked and unfettered by civilization and its shackles. This, as you might imagine, was double-edged. The Roman poet Horace called him Mercurialium, custos virorum, the guardian of mercurial men. He had a temple on Tiber Island in Rome, which had been funded at the beginning of the 2nd century BCE by fines levied from some people called pecuarii, meaning something like grazers, describing, it seems, some opportunists convicted of using public land to graze their flocks. He had a festival day on the Ides of February, celebrating the dedication of this temple, but he also had another dedicated festival day on December the 5th. Both days were called Faunalia, and were occasions for rustic shindigs at the temple and for rural people in the countryside. One of the most celebrated ancient depictions of a faun comes from Pompeii, discovered in October 1830. It's a bronze statue found in the atrium of a luxurious house that took its name from this discovery. It's known as the House of the Faun. The statue stood centrally in the open space called the impluvium, a shallow rectangular pool that gathered rainwater, and it stood as a centerpiece. It's a glorious depiction of what at first glance looks like an exuberant naked man, but on closer inspection reveals little horns and at the back a bouncing goat tail. He's jubilant, caught, it seems, in the moment of dancing ecstasy, eyes turned upwards, arms raised, leaping forward in full momentum. This captures perfectly the emotion and behaviour of all the fauns of Roman literature. And yet, you might be wondering if this is what the Greeks called a satyr, and indeed you might have even read some confident assertions that this is, in fact, a satyr. But it's not. Among other distinctions, satyrs had horsetails and horse ears and were undesirable party animals known for their comedic antics and drunken ill behaviour, led by Dionysus and old Silenus, a snub-nosed, balding drunkard who also had the ears and tails of an ass. Fauns, by comparison, caprine bodily form aside, were not known to fall into a drunken stupor at the first pop of an amphora cork, and were traditionally in a far more sacral, ecstatic state, as guardians and embodiments of the dancing wilds, as well as of shepherds and flocks. Similarly, by now you've no doubt wondered whether Faunus wasn't himself the Roman version of Greek Pan, that half man, half goat, earthy, lustful and terrifyingly unpredictable god of nature, who represented for the Greeks divine wilderness and the erotic rapture of our untamed selves. This assertion is often made, as it was even in ancient times. Clearly, there's an overlap in conceptual territory, and this overlap did come to influence the artistic representation of fauns in particular, which seemingly, due to Greek influence, began to be represented more and more often with goat legs. So Faunus and Pan eventually bore many superficial similarities. However, they were not one and the same. They had a different provenance and different fundamental character, and Roman literature distinguishes them generally, sometimes including both of them separately in lists. Although naturally over time conflations also happened, and some ancient writers made a concerted effort to tally the two. Dionysius of Halicarnassus, however, himself a Greek historian of the 1st century CE, wrote about the origins of Rome, and he had experienced Faunus as an indigenous Latin god. In describing the first landing of Greeks in the region of Proto-Rome, he writes, "It chanced that the kingdom of the Aborigines," that is, the Aborigines or the indigenous Italic peoples, had been inherited at that time by Faunus, a descendant of Mars, it is said, a man of prudence as well as energy, whom the Romans in their sacrifices and songs honour as one of the gods of their country. While the legend is of course make-believe, the sacrifices and songs for Faunus that Dionysius knew about in his own days were not. We might turn to Lucretius for a sense of the landscape these various gods and creatures shared. Lucretius, the splendid Roman philosopher-poet, wrote one surviving treatise on the nature of things that was an attempt to describe the world rationally and even scientifically according to his Epicurean worldview, and thereby do away with all the gods and monsters that crippled people with fears and superstitions. So, in the excerpt I'll read to you, he starts out trying to explain his understanding of sound, trying to demystify echoes and how sounds might travel and multiply, and how these might be mistaken for the sounds of nymphs and satyrs and fauns in the night. And note that Lucretius distinguishes these, although he doesn't actually believe they exist. He writes, "And furthermore, when once a single word departs the crier's mouth, it will be heard by all, and thus we hear it scattering through many voices, thus partitioning itself for separate ears, that they might hear the form they've planted and a tone that's clear. But any part that does not strike the ears themselves is borne beyond and disappears, lost in the winds. A part returns a sound from solid porticos, forced to rebound, and mocks the ear with just a parody of words from time to time. Consequently, when friends have wandered from their chosen track, you may explain to all how rocks give back. Like words out of the mountain's wilderness, as we call out to them, I've heard no less than 6 or 7 voices that were thrown from certain places when one voice alone had been sent out. The mountains would vibrate against each other, dwellers nearby state that nymphs and goat-foot satyrs there abound, and fauns, which with their nightly antics sound will often break the silence, while lute strings and from the panpipe winning murmurings pour out, and all the farmers far and wide hear Pan, who shakes his head from side to side and runs his lips across the reeds, in case the flute should cease to bless this woodland place with music. So here is a landscape filled with these various woodland divinities. The fauns are the ones to whom nightly sounds drifting out of wild places are attributed, and here too is Pan and the haunting sound of his reed flute. All of these things, Lucretius tries to insist, are mere echoes. But it's interesting that he is clearly arguing against the opinion of all the people who believe otherwise, the people who, he says, dwell nearby and who hear the nocturnal antics of the fauns and their companions. It's also interesting that, counter to Lucretius's aim of alleviating people of their dread of the gods and superstitious fears, he says these beliefs are comforting. Other prodigies as well they tell of, he says, lest folks fancy that they dwell in lonely spots by the divinities themselves forsaken. In other words, he's saying that the loneliness of a wilderness devoid of all these divine dancing inhabitants is an altogether more profound sort of loneliness. An empty wilderness is not only a sorry place, but a more creepy and desolate one. And so, according to Lucretius, people preferred to believe these places were blessed with the music and jubilation of these various woodland beings, even if their presence was, as I said, double-edged. The wild nature of fauns, and in particular Faunus, meant that just like nature itself, benevolence was never guaranteed. On the one hand, Roman literature liked to romanticize bucolic scenes of rustic life and idealized honest simplicity, and they liked to look back to earlier times as representative of this. A time when, as a much-quoted line from Latin literature ran, the fauns and seers used to sing. But, on the other hand, there was an intrinsic and deeply felt vulnerability to being subject to nature, and therefore a need to be in its good graces in order to be protected from it. In the Roman pantheon, he was closely related to Silvanus, who we met a couple of episodes ago. As we heard Pliny the Elder explain, the collective protection and guardianship of all the trees in the forest in sum fell to Silvanus and Faunus, alongside various nymphs. And Faunus was thought sometimes to frighten travellers in the forest with his voice, but equally he might, if kindly disposed, save visitors there from its various dangers. Horace, for example, recounts a close encounter. Writing to his patron Maecenas, who has recently recovered from the clutches of a dire illness, Horace explains that he, meanwhile, nearly got flattened by a falling tree. I'd have received the trunk of a tree on my head, if Faunus, the guardian of mercurial men, hadn't warded off the blow with his hand. So the credit for Horace's near escape was given to the divine intervention of Faunus, who he imagines vividly as physically interceding with his hand to push the trunk out of harm's way. In gratitude for both his own and Maecenas' deliverance from the doors of death, he tells his friend, "So remember to make due offering. You build a votive shrine. I'll come and sacrifice a humble lamb." Faunus's help must not go unacknowledged. In those early times when fauns and seers used to sing, there's a memory, real or imagined, of a time when the oracles and prophecies of fauns were plentiful and held in high esteem. The seers alongside them in this much-quoted line are the vates, soothsayers, who were divinely inspired and able to prophesy. Historically, they were particularly prevalent in Rome, on the hill that took their name, the Mons Vaticanus, or Vatican Hill. And this is obviously where the Vatican itself now stands. This once served as a site for prophecy, divination, and inspired oracles. The name Vatican is generally believed to be derived from two Latin words, vates, meaning seer or prophet or soothsayer, and canere, meaning to sing or chant, because soothsayers often used to sing the fates, and songs and incantations were considered a powerful medium for communicating with the gods and delivering divine messages. And now recall the nymph Canens, whose name also derives from the verb canere, to sing, who could sing all nature back into itself. And remember that she was Faunus's mother, and his father was Picus, who delivered prophetic messages in the woods with his tapping. And you can see how all these ideas and associations flow through Faunus, whose disembodied voice, drifting out of the woods at night, both terrified people and delivered useful prophetic messages. Accordingly, Faunus could bring nightmares, what Pliny the Elder calls the mocking delusions that he brought upon people during sleep. He notes that the antidote to these faun-induced nightmares is a flower, the peony. However, collecting this was not without its own dangers, as Pliny also relates. They recommend us to uproot it at night time, because the woodpecker of Mars, should he see the act, will attack the eyes in its defense. And this is a disconcerting glimpse of the friendly woodpecker and the faun in their wild habitat, looking after their own interests. The faun who brings nightmares, and his woodpecker father pecking out the eyes of people who come into the woods seeking protection from them. And picking peonies at night in the woods to prevent nightmares and save your eyes from the long beak of an angry woodpecker must have been in itself an unsettling activity, to say the least. Pliny says the peonies grow on shady mountainsides, and he claims it was the first flower to be discovered. Altogether, this has the air of an ancient complex of ideas and folk beliefs, representing an interesting oscillation between the idyllic and the nightmarish that Faunus seems to embody, which is indicative, it seems, of the ambiguity and amoral character of nature itself, and perhaps, by extension, human nature. The nightmares Faunus can bring are connected both to the voices emanating from the woods at night and his ability to prophesy. One of the ways he brought about knowledge of the future was also through dreams. Seekers wanting information and foreknowledge of the things to come could seek him out through incubation oracles, that is, oracles delivered in dreams. A practice of such incubation and the seeking out and receiving of prophecies and dreams is described for us in some detail by Virgil in his epic poem, the Aeneid, describing the prehistory of the Latin race, and it may well reflect practices maintained in folk customs in the Rome of Virgil's own day. Rome's legendary proto-king Latinus, who I mentioned in the previous episode and from whom the Latins derived their name, was, as you may also recall, the son of Faunus. In the epic, this king has had a troubling vision, and so he decides to take action to find out what it means, and he performs the rituals to invite a dream oracle. This is how Virgil describes what he did. Then the king, troubled by the vision, visited the oracle of Faunus, his far-speaking father, and consulted the groves below high Albunea, mightiest of forests, that echoed with the sacred fountain and breathed a deadly vapour from the dark. The people of Italy and all the Enotrian lands sought answers to their doubts from that place. When the priest brought offerings there and found sleep in the silent night, lying on spread fleeces of sacrificed sheep, he saw there many ghosts, flitting in marvellous forms, and heard various voices, had speech with the gods, and talked with Acheron in the depths of Avernus. Now, Acheron is the river of woe, one of the 5 rivers of the underworld, and Avernus was a real place, a poisonous volcanic crater near Napoli, which was believed to be an entrance to the underworld. So these visions the priest would habitually invite at the oracle of Faunus were coming from a dark place, from the land of the dead. And when old King Latinus goes to the same location, he conducts the ritual himself, as Virgil continues to describe. And here the king Latinus, himself seeking an answer, slaughtered 100 woolly sheep according to the rite, and lay there supported by their skins and woolly fleeces. Suddenly, a voice emerged from the deep wood. The voice is that of Faunus, and he gives the king, his son, the advice he needs to go forth and marry the right woman, whose lineage will, by long degrees, eventually end up with Romulus and Remus and the Roman populace. Ovid also describes this incubation ritual in the context of Numa Pompilius, Rome's second king after Romulus, and here's how Ovid describes it. There was an ancient wood, long unprofaned by the axe, left sacred to the god of Minalus. He means Faunus. He, to the quiet mind, gave answers in the silence of the night. Here Numa sacrificed 2 ewes. The first fell in honour of Faunus, the second fell in honour of gentle sleep. The fleeces of both were spread on the hard ground. Twice the king's unshorn head was sprinkled with water from a spring. Twice he veiled his brows with beech leaves. He refrained from the pleasures of love. No flesh might be served up to him at table. He might wear no ring on his fingers. Covered with a rough garment, he laid himself down on the fresh fleeces after worshipping the god in the appropriate words. Meantime, her calm brow wreathed with poppies, night drew on, and in her train brought darkling dreams. Faunus was come, and setting his hard hoof on the sheep's fleeces on the right side of the bed, uttered these words. He goes on to give his prophetic advice, after which Numa wakes up and the story moves on. But that image of the supplicant king asleep on the ground on the skins and fleece of freshly slain sheep, and the sudden arrival of the hard hoof of Faunus in front of his sleeping face is one that really stays with me for some reason. Maybe because it's something very tangible and hard, stomping suddenly out of all of the nebulous, disembodied, drifting voices we usually receive from Faunus. It's suddenly solid and uncomfortably close. Of the god here, we're only given the description of the hard hoof on the soft fleece, but I think that thud is enough again to give us the holy shivers. In historical times too, and while people were awake, his voice was thought to be heard delivering unsolicited prophecies. Cicero records, for example, a popular belief that fauns were heard in the middle of battles, perhaps because these occurred in wild places or open spaces with nearby woods. Cicero writes, "Again, we are told that fauns have often been heard in battle, and that during turbulent times, truly prophetic messages have been sent from mysterious places." In fact, we find an example of this in Dionysius of Halicarnassus, describing for his Greek audience a battle in the early Republic, which was brutal and evenly matched, with both sides suffering heavy losses, with victory uncertain and morale shaken, especially for the Romans who had just lost their leader. Dionysius describes dejection and despair on both sides. The Roman troops were considering quitting their camp in the night, but while they were considering these things and discussing them among themselves, he says, about the time of the first watch, a voice was heard from the grove near which they were encamped, calling aloud to both armies in such a manner as to be heard by all of them. It may have been the voice of the hero to whom the precinct was consecrated, or it may have been that of Faunus, as he is called. And he then goes on helpfully to describe Faunus for the Greeks who may not be familiar with him. For the Romans, he explains, attribute panics to this divinity, and whatever apparitions come to men's sight, now in one shape and now in another, inspiring terror, or whatever supernatural voices come to their ears to disturb them, are the work, they say, of this god. Faunus's voice in this instance delivers a prophecy that the Romans will win, and so, heartened, the troops go ahead the next day and indeed emerge victorious. But for us, the important detail in Dionysius' account are in his description of Faunus, who is here expressly shape-shifting, an eerie divine being responsible for all the unexplained oracular noises. And for panics, which Dionysius uses in the true Greek sense, denoting the terror and stultifying confusion that can be caused by Pan when he's feeling disruptive. This state he recognized being attributed to Faunus in the Roman world, where it was experienced more as a sudden terror that might take hold of you in the woods. Now there was another very old and famous Roman myth involving King Numa and Picus and Faunus that concerns their esoteric knowledge forbidden to humans, and also, if you pay attention, a wrestling of them down and fixing them down temporarily in bodily form. And the myth is important to the city's history and how it negotiated its relationship to Jupiter. It occurs in a time during Numa's reign, in which lightning was falling uncontrollably from the sky with terrifying force and in devastating quantities. The people were in great fear, and so Numa spoke to the goddess Egeria and asked her what was to be done. You see, in those early days of the city, it hadn't yet been decided how the people were to appease Jupiter and how they should respond to the lightning he hurled, so it fell to Numa to work this out. "Fear not overmuch," the goddess told Numa, according to the poet Ovid. "It is possible to expiate the thunderbolt, and the wrath of angry Jove can be averted. But Picus and Faunus, each of them a deity native to Roman soil, will be able to teach the ritual of expiation. They will teach it only upon compulsion. Catch them and clap them in bonds." And she revealed the ruse by which they could be caught. "Under the Aventine," Ovid continues, "there lay a grove black with the shade of holm oaks. At the sight of it you could say, 'There is a spirit here.' A grassy area was in the midst and veiled by green moss, and there trickled from a rock a stream of never-failing water. At it, Faunus and Picus would often drink alone. And to this place King Numa came and sacrificed a sheep to the spring, and set out bowls of fragrant wine. Then with his men he hid close within a cave. To their accustomed springs the woodland spirits came, and slaked their thirst with copious draughts of wine. Sleep followed the debauch, and from the chill cave Numa came forth and thrust the sleepers' hands into tight shackles. When slumber left them, they tried and strained to burst the shackles, but the more they strained, the stronger held the shackles. And then Numa spoke. "Gods of the groves, forgive my deed. If you accept that my mind harbours no ill intent, and show me in what way a thunderbolt can be expiated." Thus Numa spoke, and thus, shaking his horns, Faunus replied. "Thou askest great things, such as it is not lawful for thee to learn by our disclosure. Divinities like ours have their appointed bounds. Rustic deities are we, who have dominion in the mountains high. Jove has mastery over his own weapons. Him thou couldst never draw thyself down from heaven, but still thou mayest yet be able, if only thou wilt make use of our help." So Faunus spoke, and Picus agreed. "But take our shackles off," he said. The story continues. Numa gets the information he needs and goes on to negotiate a favourable deal with Jupiter. It's the appearance of Picus and Faunus in this myth which is telling, since they're the ones with the secret knowledge of the divine, befitting the oracular powers of both. Encapsulated in the myth is something of a twist in that Faunus is the one sleeping and caught unawares, and it's only because they've been intoxicated and ambushed that they've been caught. These elusive divine characters, sprung upon in their sleep and shackled, are temporarily forced to be present, to maintain a static, visible form, and, this being an affront to their character, they will not divulge anything until they are released. So, aside from everything else going on in this tale, this short entrapment of Picus and Faunus wrests them into view, forces them briefly into our sights, and then lets them go. It's perhaps their lowest moment as wild, divine creatures when they are captured and outsmarted by humankind, and yet their divine knowledge secures their release. The whole tale is a strange one, but something at the heart of it brings us back to the ideas with which we began, the question of nature and culture, man and beast, civilization and the untrammeled wilds. there's something in the shackling of Picus and Faunus and the need to set them free that is redolent with that essence of the natural world, which we are unable to get a firm grip on, the thing we catch in fleeting moments, but that always eludes us. Fauns, like all hybrid creatures in classical mythology, are always liminal, halfway beings that test the edges of thought and introspection. Such creatures are sometimes wondrous, like the winged horse Pegasus, but they're often monstrous, like the dreaded Minotaur, half man, half bull, or the vicious harpies, half woman, half bird. And they're all monsters, in Foucault's sense, of transgressing the natural limits and transgressing classifications. Jeremy McInerney has written very engagingly on this subject, and I highly recommend his book, Centaurs and Snake Kings, if you're interested in such hybrid creatures in the Greek imagination. In this scholarly but highly readable book, McInerney writes, "Monsters patrol the boundaries of the permissible and the illicit." But he also points out that, in part, the hybrid's power arises from the very fact that hybridity is not identical to monstrosity. His example is Chiron, the beloved and wise centaur, part man, part horse, and he later concludes, hybrids, therefore, are not a simple subset of monsters. They share with monsters the potential to serve as a counterpart to our humanity, helping to define oppositionally the category we inhabit, yet at other times they blur the boundary and suggest a space at a tangent to the conventional. Fauns, too, inhabit this space. McInerney brings his argument to anomalies and the anomalous, but I think in the case of fauns, I'd rather characterize the blurred boundaries between our wild and civilized selves as nostalgia. Nostalgia in the ancient Roman world for a lost rustic past, but also a very human nostalgia many of you have no doubt experienced at various moments when in wild places which we feel we once knew intimately. A sense of loss, our exile from Eden, and the strange isolation we've created for ourselves as a species. Nostalgia is the right word, derived from Greek nostos, which denotes a homecoming. It is exactly that uncanny, unhomely homecoming earlier described, the unheimlich, the fauns who are part like us and part very other, double-edged, legs in and out of cloven hooves. It's unclear whether they represent the human emerging from nature or the human returning to beast and bestiality. They straddle both, just as Faunus brings nightmares and Picus might go for your eyes, so too they are joyous and helpful guardians, full of all the ecstasy and abandon of life fully realized and unleashed in the wilds of our past, in the thickets of our imagination. Faunus represents that thing repressed, suddenly coming to the surface, escaping the shackles like those by which Numa temporarily trapped him, released back into the wild, into his own nature, into music, and dancing and dancing and dancing. In that sense, Faunus represents everything we might simultaneously like best and fear most about ourselves, and he represents spring and life and woodlands filled with song, and that very Roman compulsion to seize the day. Now it's right to garland our gleaming heads with green myrtle or flowers, says Horace in an ode to spring. Whatever the unfrozen earth now bears, now it's right to sacrifice to Faunus in groves that are filled with shadow, whether he asks a lamb or prefers a young goat. Pale death knocks with an impartial foot at the door of the poor man's cottage and at the prince's gate. Oh, Cestus, my friend, the span of brief life prevents us from ever depending on distant hope. The Memento Mori is not a pessimistic overture from a party pooper, but rather an invitation to join the party, a reason not to delay in embracing life and its pleasures. So the poet Martial, in an epigram celebrating one particular tree, writes, "Often under this tree have the playful fauns sported with their midnight music, and the pipe has startled the quiet homestead. Often has the woodland nymph, while flying from the nocturnal marauder, fan across the solitary fields, sought shelter beneath it, and often have the household gods retained the odour of the bacchanalian banquets, which by their libations have developed its luxuriance. The turf has been strewed and vermillioned with the garlands of yesterday, and no man could distinguish the roses that had belonged to his own." In the aftermath of euphoric celebration, the scattered petals of everyone's unravelled garlands are all mixed up. Forms and identities are all dissolved, and the party is over. But a lingering atmosphere of triumphant jubilation prevails. And so to end, here, rather marvellously, is a prayer to Faunus himself from the hand of Horus to the god on the occasion of his festival day, the Faunalia, a god who, true to his nature, you may never have heard of, but have somehow always known. A god who is Roman and belongs to a very different world, and yet one who we may somehow know more intimately than all the rest. Here is his simple but lovely prayer. Faunus, the lover of nymphs who are fleeing, may you pass gently over my boundaries, my sunny fields, and as you go by, be kind to all my newborn. If at the end of the year a tender goat is sacrificed to you, if the full bowls of wine aren't lacking, friend of Venus, the old altar smoking with incense, all the flocks gambol over the grassy plain when the 5th of December returns for you. The festive village empties into the fields, and the idle herd. The wolf wanders among the audacious lambs, and for you the woods wildly scatter their leaves.